All right, good evening everybody, and a warm welcome to those attending and also to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Finance and Corporate Services Select Committee, and my name is Councillor John Riley, and I'm the chairman of this meeting. The key role of this committee is to monitor the performance of local public services within our remit and to hold in-depth reviews on topics of resident interest. We engage with a range of external witnesses in our activity, which can include community groups, residents, and subject matter experts. Where we identify areas for change or improvement, we make recommendations to the decision-making cabinet. Details of the business to be considered today is shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. For those present in the room and intending to speak, please note that you will be filmed and any statement you make will be recorded and made public. For those in the public gallery, you won't be on camera, and we are not overly troubled by a lot of people in the public gallery. A reminder to councillors, officers and those speaking today that you should turn your microphone button on when speaking. This will ensure you can be heard in the room and by those watching online. What I'm going to do is to go around the table starting from my right and let people introduce themselves.
Councillor Philip Cawthorne.
Councillor Kaushik Banerjee.
Evening, Councillor Kishan Bhatt.
Councillor Gasharan Mand.
Councillor Narinda Gold.
Councillor Stuart Mathers, Labour Lead.
Matthew Kelly, Head of Procurement and Commissioning.
Ian Waters, Director of Strategic and Operational Finance.
Marie Stokes, Finance Business Partner.
Ian Anderson, Business Manager, Complaints and Inquiries.
All right, thank you very much. Everyone got their microphones off? Yeah, good, okay. And so some housekeeping. We're not expecting any fire drill, but if the fire alarm does go off, please follow the officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting point, which is the Civic Centre forecourt. Please keep your mobile devices either off or put them on silent. And there are resident feedback forms available in the room, or there is a version online under the broadcast. All right. All items will be, I think there aren't any part 2 items, so they'll all be in part 1. So, agenda. Apologies for absence.
Yes, apologies received from Councillor Lewis, with Councillor Philip Cawthorne present as his substitute.
Excellent, thank you, and welcome Councillor Cawthorne to our meeting. Declarations of interest in matters coming before the committee. Any of the usual interests or no? All right. And as I say, to confirm that all items of business that are marked in part 1 will be public, and there are no items in part 2. We'll now look at the well, before we do that, let me just say this, that in order to I'll do that in a minute. In order to get these matters in a slightly different order, after we've looked at the minutes, we'll then go to item 6, which is the mid-year budget update report. Then we'll do the scoping report for procurement, and then we'll look at the annual complaints and service update report. I just thought that was a better balance and a better way of going about it. All right, minutes of the previous meeting. Everyone's had those. Any comments? No. Are those minutes agreed? Thank you very much. All right. And just for form, I expect Neil would want me to say item 4 to confirm the items before us will be in part 1. Okay, so item 5, which item 5 in the running order, but item 6 is the our Pack B, which is the mid-year budget update report. It's interesting to note and important to note that this is by way of a framework against which the subsequent meetings are going to be held as we go towards budget time. So this is very much a document to note and be aware of in terms of the overlay that we will have in what can only be described as a changing landscape, or a rapidly changing landscape, as people want to say. There is, I'll just make a few remarks and then hand over to Ian. There's a bit of a theme that goes on through this informative but relatively short document, which kept cropping up, which said driven by inflation, and certainly the most recent figures appear to be that forecasts are looking at 13% next month, and then depending on which either newspaper or financial institution you listen to, 18 and 22% in the early part of next year. That just sets, it seems to me, a very difficult trend in terms of forecast and actual effect, because what the council were doing last year in terms of being able to make projections and looking at where we were going to be and so forth has just been put into disarray, really. I mean, not just us, everybody. So that's something I think we need to strongly bear in mind. But this is a very helpful overlay, and will help us as we go through the meetings that get ever closer to budget setting. The detail is something that will come to us later on, and we can look at that, bearing in mind where we are with these figures. This is, I think, month 3, isn't it, in regard to the cycle that this document relates to. And I should imagine, bearing in mind how things are going in terms of inflationary pressures, and post 31st of March, when the COVID money was stopped, didn't just run out or was easily pushed forward, it just stopped completely. We've still got significant pressures from the effects of COVID in any event, especially in regard to service areas and so forth. Anyway, right, enough from me. Ian, do you want to help us with this?
Thank you, Chairman. So I was going to provide you some sort of brief covering commentary on the paper, and then sort of open the floor to the committee in terms of any particular questions or queries. As Councillor Riley mentioned, this is our first of 2 appearances in front of the committee this year. So in line with the usual timetable, we're here this month to really run through that context in which the budget will need to be set, which again is, I have to admit, is one of the more challenging years. I've looked at the budget myself and sort of been working on it, and particularly in terms of that moving piece around inflation and where that's likely to land. So we'll be back in January with sort of specific proposals as part of once the Cabinet have presented the consultation budget. Sort of myself and colleagues from Finance will be attending the various select committees to give you the opportunity to sort of ask any further detailed questions around those proposals. At that point in time, my colleague Marie will be able to sort of comment more. She'll be involved in more of that, sort of looking at the detailed budget proposals. So unfortunately today Marie's sort of partly here to say hello to the committee and almost sort of make a first appearance, but she will have more to say in future meetings. So I suppose briefly then on the context that we're sort of setting out in the report, I won't talk through the paper verbatim or anything, but I think as the Chairman noted, there's really 2 key things I think driving our budget position this year that are different to other years. One of those is the COVID-19 legacy. The government funding has, to all extent and purposes, dried up in terms of support for those, but we are seeing legacy pressures impacting on our position. We had an assessment of those included in the budget that we set back in February for the forthcoming year. Within the budget monitoring position, we are seeing higher pressures than anticipated, but they are in areas that we had identified. A couple of key points there to pick up are some of this is to do with areas such as social care, where it's driven demand, and therefore more people coming through the door, therefore we need to support more residents. In other areas, it's sort of really some of that, I suppose, the new normal and changes in the way that we're working and living. So in terms of whether it's pressures on the operation of leisure centres, or whether it's about how often people use car parks because we've got less people coming into town centres. Those are areas we continue to closely monitor and will feed into the MTFF and so the budgets going forward as necessary. Inflation is presenting a much larger challenge. So I won't dwell on the percentage rates again, but clearly back when we set the budget in February, we were looking at a sort of 5%, which was a step change from where we'd been previously. We continue to closely monitor this. We work very closely with, across the council officers, working very closely with suppliers, the support of procurement and other kind of service areas to make sure that we really understand how inflation is feeding through and making sure that we're picking up on those costs and factoring them into budget estimates. The budget monitoring position as currently presented, while we can never say we've anticipated everything, we're picking up on those costs coming through. and really the in-year strategy for dealing with these is to make use of those earmarked reserves that we've been able to set aside for exactly these kind of risks, which should let us manage that in the short term. In terms of the medium-term response to this, some of it as a national issue, we will look to, we will obviously be looking to whether government funding regime, what that looks like going forward. But we are currently sort of revisiting really the broader sort of savings programme, the work on driving efficiencies out in the way we run the council as a mechanism for bridging that gap on a more sustainable basis. I suppose they were my sort of brief kind of introductory remarks. I suppose at that point I'll hand back to yourself, Chairman.
Did you want to add? Okay, so that's the sort of broad outline and outlook against which I know I'm getting awful feedback. I don't know why. Against which we will look at the detail as time goes on. Any questions? Councillor? Oh, right, Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. That works? Yes, that is working. They're very piercing today, aren't they? I'll step back. I'm not known for being quiet. I suppose this is helpful. I suppose what would be really helpful is to get an understanding in anything that comes to the committee on the kind of what is COVID orientated and what is inflationary orientated. I know there's some description and it is meant for an overview. The council effectively had a kind of £4 million surplus, of which some of it was used on COVID, some of it was used on pressure demands, etc. And I guess what mechanisms are in place to ensure that we're not going to get any more COVID funding, but any kind of government grants where it's about legacy or longevity, and hopefully we never have a pandemic just never again really. But kind of what mechanisms are in place, because there's a loss of income because of COVID, which was that forecast, or is this just because of the newer times, an unintended consequence because of changes which we see is impacting retail and hospitality and all the different sectors? And in terms of inflation, so with the Bank of England saying that they are looking to bring it down to 2% in 2 years, I mean, I won't say any more than that. But with that in mind, what measures are you taking to look at how you predict inflation? And with the short-term huge spikes of inflation, there also is going to be a rising in interest rates. What impact is that likely to have in the longer term picture, the 5-year plan and beyond? So I guess, I know there's no crystal ball. I know inflation has targets, but targets in reality are different from the Bank of England. But they do control interest rates, which is one of their ways of doing it. So I guess it's a little bit of what things are in place to make sure that we are accurately projecting in a very moving climate.
Thank you, Councillor. So I think if I run through in turn, I think we're talking in terms of how we've gone about assessing the COVID-19 impact going forward, and maybe how that feeds into sort of conversations with government and other stakeholders. What the steps we're taking to try and understand inflation, and maybe that, as you say, that's sort of not quite crystal ball, but what might this look like in a couple of years' time, and what might we need to manage, and then finally, what does that potentially mean for interest rates, and that again loops back into the budget position. So I think running through those in turn, I think on COVID-19. Over the last couple of years, we've had sort of a fair amount of experience as an organisation in terms of seeing what that impact was looking like during the pandemic. During last year's budget setting cycle, we then undertook a real attempt to sort of say, well, actually, which ones of these items can we see tracking forward? And I think one of the key examples there I point to is we were sort of looking at sort of parking income volumes being down as a result of people not coming into town centres, the car parks being less in use. At the time we set the budget, we pitched that at a figure of sort of 90% of pre-pandemic levels. Where we're currently seeing that and monitoring is around 80% of pre-pandemic levels in terms of the income coming through the car parks, and as a proxy for usage. So I think I'm quite confident that what we're doing through the monitoring process at the minute is refining those estimates of the extent of the impact in those areas is hitting, rather than, I suppose, new pressures emerging that we hadn't previously anticipated a COVID-related hit. In terms of inflation, as you say, I think the Bank of England forecasts on inflation have this sort of inbuilt optimism in terms of their mandate is to return that inflation rate to 2%, and lo and behold, by the end of the graph they present, it's back at 2%. So what we do, we have a range of sort of access to kind of external advisor support. We'll compare assumptions with our kind of colleagues. We've got peer networks across sort of financial planning groups, the Society of London Treasurers, where we can see what others are seeing. We also have sort of dedicated kind of treasury management support where we're sort of engaging with specialists in the area, where we can get, in a sense, we're trying to find as many different views of what that inflation position looks like, and then we'll kind of synthesize those ourselves. But I think looking at those inflation assumptions, I think the 2% figure forecast by the Bank of England in a couple of years' time is definitely at the optimistic end of that range that's being presented. And I suppose finally, in terms of how the inflation rates feed into interest rates, so the majority of our borrowing we source from the Public Works Loan Board, so in effect the Treasury, sort of up in Westminster. Those borrowing rates are pegged to kind of UK government gilt, so in effect in a higher inflation environment we are seeing borrowing costs rising. What we're doing in terms of looking at our capital programme is, as ever, we will look at what those borrowing costs, how they impact, what that's going to look like, and that will feed into the kind of the assessment of actually the financial sort of the financial case for those investments. That being said, there's an awful lot of activity we undertake in our capital programmes, say the investment in school places, where actually there is there's always going to be an underlying service requirement, and therefore kind of the costs where they feed through will feed through.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of questions, Ian, if I may. I note the use of the word temporary increases in paragraph 5 or point 5 on page 2. A brave thing to say. I just wonder what our sense is, because clearly we don't know, and clearly we are very much operating on a shifting sand at the moment, given where we are. But I just wonder whether you have any thoughts on that. The other thing, and I don't suppose you know about this one, because it's really around much of what we've been hearing lately about aligning the health and social care economy. Much has been talked about in terms of the value of social care in preventing people accessing clinical services and creating budgetary headroom nationally to make that possible. I don't suppose we'll know anything yet about how that's going to pan out, but certainly we want to watch, I think, because there could be some benefit there. Don't know if you've got anything to say about that, but feel free, otherwise we'll take it to watching brief, if that's okay, Chairman. So I suppose a question and an observation that you might want to comment on. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So yes, so in terms of talking to temporary inflationary pressures, I think yes, maybe temporary may be an optimistic word if that's the way to go. Or I think the way we've sort of framed it in terms of looking at figures is that we were modelling back in February when we looked at the MTFF that we'd have maybe 2 years off higher than the traditional levels of inflation. I think when we look at sort of economic commentators, I think potentially that 2 years is now a longer period, but I think that there is, although the 2% return to the Bank of England rate may be optimistic, I think there's a question there about, sort of if we are looking at sort of double-digit inflation rates, kind of what's a practical horizon over which that could operate before there's some measure of intervention from government and other actors. In terms of the sort of links to the health and social care economy, I think it's definitely one that we're sort of monitoring as officers, because we've got things like the funding that's being invested that was originally going to be funded through the national insurance increases, sort of pending kind of recent events, whereby there was that split between funding to go into health, funding to go into social care. Of course, the kind of comprehensive spending review process, the way that we see budgets from government that are feeding through to us is often quite opaque in terms of us being able to see how that's moving. But we're definitely keen. Anything where we're kind of contributing to those kind of joint economies, we certainly will be trying to leverage that into a lobbying position in terms of saying, well, any support we can have from the savings would be much appreciated to support local services.
And there'll be a statement, I understand, coming out in the next 2 weeks with the new Chancellor about the direction of travel. So that is likely to have an impact across the board on what we do. But then only 2 weeks ago, the activities of others are very far away caused an absolute seismic shift in the West. So there's no guarantee that something else like that, we can plot and get things ready as much as we like in some ways, but there are more than ever significant external pressures and potentials that we can't even, even a couple of weeks prior to a fortnight ago, we wouldn't have known what he was going to do. And that has a sudden impact, not just on us, obviously, but on many other countries. But yet we have to be able to deal with those waves. All right. Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose it's going back to the cost of capital, etc. There's no mention here of the HRA or necessarily the impact of the DSG, and that will have some inflationary costs now built into it under already a difficult, although not directly our budget, but a difficult setting. My concern with that is that's meant that the unidentified savings, which were around 5.5, have now doubled, are looking to double again next year. And I guess the foundation in which these problematic times have landed on, so had there have been more identified savings earlier, it could have saved more sooner, and therefore it wouldn't be as difficult as it is now. And I suppose my overall question is without better funding from central government, is there a real risk here that the Cabinet will struggle to balance the budget, and therefore Council will struggle? And I'm not saying that's unique to Hillingdon, because I think that's going to be across the country. But I guess I'm pleading if the Prime Minister was tapped into this feed to say, can we have more money, because it's essential to maintain services that residents need. And I guess if it was the current funding formula, we would be in dire circumstances alongside many other local authorities. So if you could comment a little bit on the capital impacts, and then a little on the underlying savings, that would reassure me that now the Prime Minister has heard me speak through the Select Committee, that funding may follow.
Yes, so I believe I can double check and confirm with Neil, but I think in terms of the HRA and DSG positions, I think we've got them. I think it's on the resident services and then on the education and young people's committees in terms of how we've linked them.
Sorry, Chair, if I may, just because this is a finance remit, I think they always add context to, because they have an impact. So, for example, the HRA does interlink, and Hillingdon First Limited, which is sometimes linked to the HRA, does link into the financing model of our revenue account. And if there are requirements through the safety valve for us to put in revenue, it should really reflect in this, because of the remit, would be my suggestion. I'm happy to be...
We'll get more detail as time goes on, and as I say, we'll have more...
Just going to say, perhaps Ian could note that for consideration for future reports, potentially.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Obviously, it's something that we keep under very close review, and we will see you at future meetings when we've got more detail and start to work towards the budget.
Cool. Thank you for your time this evening.
All right. So, where are we going now? Oh, to the procurement, which is item 7 on the agenda, but item 6 as far as we're concerned. The scoping report for the proposed review of procurement within this council.
I'll take that, Chairman, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. So members will see the report in front of them. This is a report that was worked up between myself and Matthew, who's present tonight, to answer any particularly difficult questions that I can't answer. Hopefully it is effective in setting in the context of the proposed review and some ideas around what the review could cover, and a schedule of effective witness sessions. So I open up to the committee for any comments and ask that they approve it as the next review. Thank you.
I just want to say before, because obviously we know, and Matthew wasn't here last time, we're very keen on this. And we think it's a very important, especially in the light of what we've just been talking about. It's obvious, I read somewhere that something like £300 billion of public money goes on public contracts and external procurement. Not that's for that's the whole country. That's not just for Hillingdon. I mean, if it was, we'd be doing much better. It's an extraordinarily important service, and it comes with the I don't know whether it's assistance or not of the most recent procurement bill, which aims to make the process much more clear, transparent and easy to operate. Because one of the things obviously that is of great concern is the extent to which the process of procurement is complex for small and medium-sized companies. And one of the areas I think that we were keen to look at, and we will be keen to look at going forward, is how we shape procurement slightly differently in terms of our ability to use local business more where we can. And just because you may end up with one or two or three local businesses doing a contract which previously one big company might have done, isn't necessarily a bad thing in a lot of different ways. But okay, Matthew, if you want to sort of talk us through this, it's a good report, and there's some very good ideas and pointers here. Okay, question. Oh, right. Councillor Cawthorne.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that I'm just here for this meeting, so I won't butt in too much to what you've already discussed elsewhere or what you'll come on to. But a couple of things strike me about this piece of work, and I think it's a very valid and worthy choice, if I may say so, in terms of a review topic. Because I think looking at the Appendix A, the supporting report that's come with this, something struck me very much from my time being lead member for housing some years ago. We did seem to be constrained by procurement processes which had the effect of excluding local firms. And at the top of page 68, I mean, we're talking about roofing contractors as one example. And what you'd find is local firms were often excluded. The bigger firms got it with their extensive procurement teams and what have you. And then what happened was they subcontracted the work quite often and took a slice of the funds into the bargain, which never felt at all right, really. So if that's one of the things that we're looking at as part of this process, for what it's worth, I would strongly support that. It's just an observation. Perhaps you can comment, Matthew. And I think the other thing I would just say, again, drawing on other experience, is the market development, the market shaping around some of the services that we need, certainly around social care, for example, domiciliary care, personalised care, people with personal budgets. There do seem to be some opportunities there, and I guess I don't know if I'm going off piece, and do stop me, Chairman, if you wish, but I would have thought that sort of thing is worthy of consideration. With that, I will shut up. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. So it's great. You said you're very keen, Chairman, for this to come forward, and that's great to see, because I'm a bit of a procurement geek, so I like to kind of come and talk about it, and obviously I want to try and shape it around what works for this committee. So, I mean, there is one of the things that we have lots of conversations on, both between officers and members as I talk to them, is around the SME agenda, the local business agenda, and some of that is driven by the the National Procurement Policy Statement, and we've obviously got to give due regard to that, and we expect it to kind of be strengthened over time as is the case. But I did do a previous piece on SMEs and local business, which is attached to how the council helps local small business. It's not a straightforward piece, and you'll see that from this report that's been brought previously. If there is a desire to include more of that within here, we will of course do it, and we can revisit elements of that and perhaps have further conversations. that is absolutely fine, Chair. But it's not particularly strong within the 3 themes that we have suggested so far.
Thank you, Chair. I've broadly got 4 particular observations. I like the way that the whole report's been scoped out. I think following up from the theme that we just discussed, the first topic which I had in mind was certainly exploring that a lot more, that local businesses and how they, I do feel they find the tendering process quite protracted and inaccessible. I was wondering if there's any scope in terms of assessing the guidance and assistance we provide to SMEs for applying for tenders, because a lot of the large businesses, I know this from my own practice, is that they do sometimes pay for tenders to be done for them, and I think when they're competing against those kind of large businesses, they're sort of already against the odds. The second is assessing the current criteria for awarding contracts and kind of scrutinising that closely. Thirdly, looking into the contractual terms with service providers post-tender. There's been a few issues with that previously, having had a look at the news, where during COVID, a lot of the contracts didn't have force majeure clauses, and as a result, we couldn't get out of those contracts. So kind of assessing the process for that. And lastly, I know there's a theme for value for money, which I think is quite important. So just assessing the fitness for purpose and our assessment as to the suitability and quality control of our service providers, and assessing the accountability and how to make them accountable. And I think those are the observations I have.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure, Neil, in terms of, I don't think I'm answering those now, but there are certainly themes that I will answer. I take entirely your point, Councillor, on those, and we will seek to build that into the structure and provide those answers through the future sessions.
Yeah, if I may, Councillor, just to reinforce what Matthew said, that this is a moving document, so it's only a guide at the moment, but we can absolutely make these changes and scope and fit the, if approved, the review more in line with what the committee want to see, alongside the things that perhaps we've already scoped out in this report.
Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose in order to be the most effective as a select committee in supporting improvement and change, it would be useful if the purposes or themes were a little bit more around kind of problem-solving things that are identified, rather than just generally us finding out about the processes. I suppose we could do that with supporting information, for efficiency of time. And in terms of the 3 here, there was mention around like the impact of Brexit and other regulatory changes, which I'm sure will be highlighted, but I think that was one particularly that was kind of, and I suppose in the legal and regulatory context, we're in a situation now with inflation really high. Like, where do the legal boundaries sit with kind of the change and development of kind of contracts once procured? I suppose would be part of it. You don't have to answer that now, but may be useful. And in terms of how the council delivers value for money, I think part of what we were pushing for was how it delivers value, particularly in the local context. So value for money is part of that, but how it offers value, as said, in terms of medium, small businesses, local jobs, local impact. I would be extremely interested, and I've mentioned this before, around the kind of the weighting put onto environmental and social responsibility, particularly in trying to achieve zero net carbon, which I know is mentioned as part of the objectives, but kind of some of the workings of that in delivering value for Hillingdon. And I think sometimes if we say value for money, we lose that wider impact that procurement can have. And then finally, the main concern around officer management of contracts wasn't the officers managing the contracts. It's more, we know the subcontracting impact, as already mentioned, completely undermines some of the best practice. And if we look at, for example, care in the home through care agencies, it's sometimes that contracting and it's not necessarily, there's subcontract to a degree, and then there's a quick tender change, and it's the same people in place but just a different company name, and so it's not just subcontracting but companies kind of almost, what's the word, reappearing, re-emerging with a different name, but actually it's the same people involved, and we know that if you do the same thing you get the same results, and that's never the desire of anybody, portfolio holders particularly, when it comes to trying to improve the care services, and that's a specific example, but it's across the board really. So yeah, how that's managed would be intriguing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, we can build we can build all these things into the review, and we can, I guess, it's really helpful to get the feedback, which we can myself and Neil can fine tune it.
What I'm going to suggest, there's one more comment I want to make, but what I'm going to suggest is that you guys go away and reconfigure this in the light of what the committee has said, and then come back to me, and I'll include, as ever, Councillor Mathers, looking at a sort of much more focused and scoped down series. I like the idea of it being split into three. I mean, some of what Councillor Mathers just said about the legal side, that's included in part one, to look at the legal side. I agree that we don't need a very heavy emphasis on telling us where we are and what the sort of overall context is, but at the same time a little bit of that, so we do have a sort of skeleton upon which to put the skin of what we're looking at, would be helpful. I am concerned in one sense that you both look at the balance, because at the same time as we're trying to help and encourage local business and small businesses, one of the things that put them off sometimes is included in what Councillor Cawthorne said, that the bigger companies have whole departments to deal with this subject, and then within departments have the ecology side and the net zero and so forth. We're getting that balance between being able to support and attract local businesses, and very often it's going to be not in big ticket items for the council, I guess, because I can think of some examples that I've actually sort of come across myself. But it's that balance between achievable outcomes in terms of a wider picture without harming the very people we're trying to help, who don't have the capacity or the ability to afford those kind of areas. I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but so if there's a set of criteria that a small business is never going to be able to deal with, we need to find a way of bringing them into the fold and helping them. Now, the procurement bill does shave away, I wouldn't say cut, that's too great a word in a sense, but does shave away quite a lot of what was there before in terms of regulatory requirements and so forth. Whether it goes far enough is another matter, and it's still only in its early stages. I think it's only at second reading or something along those lines. But I just think we'd like you guys to be aware of that dynamic and that conflict in the sort of information that you look into and that we get.
No, that's absolutely right. And I take your point about this, the balance, and there's lots of tools and ways of doing this. So historically, where we don't think a small local supplier can deliver it, we've looked at them being a tier 2 or tier 3 provider. But then that conflicts with this idea of, and challenges the whole subcontracting issue. And then there are the rules in terms of how we can build that into the tender process. So there's lots for us to look at there, and certainly the context is important in terms of what we can and can't do within the environment, the regulatory environment that we've got to operate within. Certainly your point, Chairman, around balance is key, and balance is never more so than in the local SME agenda, and one of the challenges there is around defining what is a local business. Is it someone who's based in the borough? Is it someone who ownership lives in the borough? Is it someone who employs in the borough? What about someone on the outskirts of the borough, a mile, 2 miles? There's a whole host of real practical challenges that we face as a procurement team in trying to define some of these, and certainly in a previous visit here we've tried to look at those, and we are doing some work, and we track our local spend, our spend with SMEs, or with local businesses I should say. So I take all the points. I think they're all really valid, and we'll build those in.
One of the other things also, and I don't know how many people to listen to these meetings, but certainly in terms of a plea to the business community, on the basis that we sort of start at home in Hillingdon, as it were. I'm aware that from comments from various business folk and others in the community about their kind of commercial fear in terms of going for some of these things, or even if they think they're allowed to. And I think that being able to put it in terms of, well, first of all, being able to put it in terms of not just sort of sending out a thing saying hands up who wants to do this and having a list, but actively maybe even roadshows. I don't know, something along those lines. I'm just sort of trying to think through things. But in the same way that we do service roadshows for other things, maybe a procurement roadshow, just to say to local businesses, look, it's not as scary as you think, or even if it is, we can help you. We might end up with 3 or 4 small companies doing what one big company might have done, and one of you looks after this aspect or that aspect, I don't know. But being able to help that, because again, there's all these warnings about small businesses having real difficulty with what we've just talked about in terms of inflation and interest rates and all the rest of it. If we're in a position, not to the exclusion of others necessarily, but certainly as a major push to help local businesses and all the other local authorities doing the same, that can't be anything but good, I think. All right, great. Any other points or anything? I think this will be a really good. We really want this to be quite radical and challenging, and I think it will be so. So if you two want to go away and sort those, I don't mean immediately, want to go away and sort those things out for us, with those things borne in mind, come back to me offline. Off the, and I'll speak to Councillor Mathers and we'll look at those. As far as witnesses are concerned, I think if you offer us, in your expertise, list of people that you think will be able to help us, I think we'll need you at most of these meetings to help us along, so that'd be good. Well, for us anyway. Yeah?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We'll pull some witnesses together.
Would it be useful to have the local Chamber of Commerce or similar business forums here as witnesses? Yeah.
We've got a borough-wide Chamber of Commerce, I believe, and then pretty much each town in the borough has got a Chamber of Commerce, and we will, and it will be useful for our officers to look into the effectiveness of those. I mean, not that many of them, but there's as I say, one for each town. I think some are clearly more effective than others. Nobody minds me saying that's pretty obvious. But and they're all struggling and worrying about what's coming down the line. And if they see this sort of even just bringing them along to tell us about stuff, I think will help and make them feel that we're there in whatever capacity we can be. Yeah, good idea. All right, thank you.
Chairman, just for the benefit of the record, then, can I just take it that is approved as the next review?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Agree. Thank you. Right, item, where are we? Oh God, I've lost it.
Back to item 5.
5, yes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. The annual complaints and service update report, page 5 to 54. Ian is here, which is good. Quite a big document, lots of information, but I think generally speaking, looking at all the various tables and everything that's been drawn together, I think I probably should say that this committee, I think I'm right in saying, is receiving this report that would otherwise in the past has gone to other committees. So we're dealing with the whole thing here under the corporate services part of our remit. It's interesting going through this to see the kind of wave from COVID and pre and post in a sense. The kind of hope and expectation that things would be different after COVID, I think, is across the board has been not found to be the case, because we're still suffering from post-COVID effects, not just in these issues, but in lots of different areas. But it does seem to me to be quite an encouraging report, and generally speaking, the sort of areas where there have been complaints or observations about service, I think. What's interesting is that some of the complaints appear to be more like service requests rather than specific complaints, observations about stuff that's gone wrong, but they get badged as complaints rather than anything else. So there is an element of that, clearly. And not surprisingly, in the sort of basically emotional type service areas, or those that strike hardest at the emotion. So at the older age bracket range and the younger age bracket range, and housing and those sorts of more concerning areas. But overall, as I say, it's a good report and shows quite a lot of balance. Do you want to add anything?
I'll summarise if that would help, Chairman. The report provides you data over 5 years, basically. So you've got the pre-COVID, post-COVID, and during the COVID period as well. Just focusing on the last year, the volume of informal complaints is significantly higher than previous years, so 4,473. The number of Stage 1 complaints is similar to previous years, which is 802. The Stage 2 complaints have increased significantly, and the Ombudsman complaints are an increase as well in those areas. The number of compliments is down, but that's by and large to do with wildflowers. There was a spate of last year where there was a significant volume of compliments for wildflowers across the borough, and that massively increased the volume of compliments we received. Just touching on those areas to start with, I suppose, the volume of informal complaints are primarily in the area of housing, waste and ASBIT. So that's the big area in terms of volume of informal complaints you've got there. Housing, it tends to be about the time it's taken to do the repairs. In terms of the homeless prevention, it's about people unhappy about the time they're having to wait before they can actually be allocated a property. So that's a big area in those two. When it comes to waste services, it's just fly tipping. That's an issue. And in terms of ASBIT, antisocial behaviour, it's about neighbours. More of them are at home and have been at home last year, and they can hear noises and stuff that where they're at work they wouldn't ordinarily do, and that's that volume of complaints in there. In terms of the number of Stage 1 complaints, what I would say to you is that the process of the complaints process is designed to reduce it. So you get the informal complaints to all the way up to the Ombudsman, it's supposed to reduce it. And when you look at the trend, it does show that. So where you have 4,473 informal complaints, you're down to 802 when it comes to the formal Stage 1 complaints procedure, which is 18% of the 4,000 odd. And then when it comes to Stage 2, it's 13% of 802. So it's the process is doing what it's designed to do to reduce. There is something I ought to say about the Stage 2 complaints, though. The increase, it has been an insignificant increase from last year to the year before that, and that's because the council as a whole made a decision to give residents the opportunity more to have the opportunity of having an formal Stage 2 complaint. So what we decided to do, rather than send them directly from Stage 1 to the Ombudsman, we actually stepped in and said, actually, let's try and actually make some more responses at Stage 2. So that's the reason for the increase in terms of that. The number of Ombudsman investigations has also significantly increased, but that's to be expected because a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the Ombudsman made a decision in the height of the COVID to pause their investigation. So for about 4 months, they decided not to investigate many of the complaints that we would have normally expected them to do. So that it's resulted in a slightly higher increase in the last year that I've provided you with. In terms of members' inquiries, volume-wise, it's pretty much similar to previous years. It hasn't changed a great deal. The main area, as it always has been, is what was described in the past as resident services, but it's now the Place Directorate. So it's all to do with planning, waste, housing. It's all in those type of areas. Adult social care and children's, in terms of comparison-wise, we actually get very few members' inquiries in those areas. But what I would say is that the adult social care and children complaints are far more complex to deal with than a waste complaint, for members' inquiry, for example, which is fairly straightforward to deal with. What I've also provided you with data showing within each ward the total number of the 3 top members' inquiries that are raised by each ward. So I thought you might be interested to see what each ward is, where everyone is focusing their members' inquiries in each ward. And interestingly enough, fly tipping, apart from Ickenham, Northwood, Uxbridge North and West Ruislip, all the other areas, fly tipping features as the main significant area where inquiries are being raised. Just one final thing on members' inquiries, I suppose, is waste services are 40%, 3,934 of all members' inquiries, so a massive volume is in that waste area. Antisocial behaviour is just 1,200, together with planning, and green spaces just over 1,000. So it's really those 4 areas in terms of members' inquiries where the volume of inquiries come through. The last thing I would say to you is on page 53, I provided you with some learning that we've identified. So things, and it's set out by each different area, so you can actually identify where the main learning that we've identified from. What I didn't include, which in some ways is maybe a given, is people do complain about delays, and and one of the themes that will emerge either as a members' inquiry or a complaint is that there is, in almost all inquiries or complaints, someone saying, actually, you took too long or you didn't meet this timeline. So that does feature as part of any of the inquiries that we receive. I think one thing I would say is within the report you'll find that our response times in some areas could be better. And, but what I would say is that as a council, we are probably one of the toughest councils in terms of the speed of response. So whereas we set our response time frame at 10 working days, if you look at our neighbouring local authorities, they'll be setting them at 20 working days, 25 working days. So we're quite tough on that, because I think what we want to do is provide the residents with the quickest response that we can, because if they've submitted a complaint, they don't want to wait ages before, a month before they get a response. So that's one thing I would just sort of say. Although in some areas our response times could be quicker, but we do set some of the toughest response times of all local authorities.
All right, Councillor. Whoops. Just me? Okay. Right, Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report. In terms of looking at limiting the escalation of complaints or better understanding complaints, particularly housing disrepair issues, I'm quite interested to see where mediation and conciliation fits in the process, because as a mediator professionally, I do feel that mediation and conciliation can really help de-escalate complaints. And because complaints might not be complaints at all, it could often be factors that are not even form part of the complaint. So the question really is, where does mediation and conciliation fit in the current stage-by-stage process? And is there any data that you can provide to show how often mediation is used? And perhaps the proposition is that I do feel that perhaps our staff in the council should be trained in mediation and conciliation to offer that process internally before it gets externalised to the Ombudsman.
In terms of mediation, Councillor, it is one of the options. So at any stage of the process, so it's either informal state or the formal stages, or before it goes to the Ombudsman. So that is an option. From my experience, very few residents take that up in terms of mediation opportunity. We do actually offer quite a few. Particularly in the ASBIT side of things, we do offer quite a lot of opportunities to mediate. But I think at that point the neighbours' views are so entrenched that one may say yes, but the other one will say no. So it is one of our options. If you ask me, have we got data to that effect, I would probably say no, we don't have data to support that. So all I can go by is what my experience is. But I do know that certainly in the ASBIT side of things, we do offer the mediation, but it's often declined. Maybe that's because of with it being a neighbourhood dispute, it's more trickier to deal with. When it comes to sort of repair side of things, when it goes to the Housing Ombudsman Service, they do offer us the opportunity to go to mediation at that point. And sometimes we say yes, but then the resident may say no, and it's that trying to get that balance between both of us saying prepared to do that. So we do want to have a go at doing that, because you are right when you say that sometimes people actually don't want to use a complaint service or they just want their problem sorted out, and sometimes they just want to talk to someone saying, look, there's this issue, I've got this issue, I don't want to write this long thing, or I don't want to speak to someone, I just want you to try and sort it out. And I think mediation does play a big part in doing that. I would say, have we got the skill set within the council? I'm not sure about that, but I can look into that and find out. I'm not sure whether there are trained mediators within the council, so I don't know that. We tend to go external, but I will find out for you.
Thank you. This is, I think, a very positive report. What it shows to me, I think, is that as an organisation, the process of dealing with multiple matters with numerous residents over a whole across the area of services means you will inevitably have issues from time to time. But it does seem to me that we learn from them and we work to resolve them. But I've got a couple of quick questions and then an observation, if I may. First one is, clearly, I suppose there's a difference between someone not liking a policy and not liking the application thereof. And do we make any kind of distinction between the two in this, or they're all treated as complaints? Second one for me is, and it's a bit of a challenge on the back of how you've responded to Councillor Batt a moment ago. In terms of discouraging complaints, in terms of getting a resolution at an early stage, I just wonder sometimes whether we are a little bit too ready to treat these things as complaints. I find I hear from residents who just use the word complaint in the letter, and they don't really they don't want to invoke a formal process. They just want a resolution. And I just wonder whether we are perhaps just hamstrung a little bit by a tendency to do that. Shoot me down in flames by all means, but that's my sense. So I just wonder whether there's a tendency just to treat things as complaints just a little bit too readily, when in fact, a quick phone call, a quick resolution could deal with it much more quickly, much more easily, and hopefully a lot cheaper as well. And then just finally an observation on members' inquiries. I understand changes afoot in terms of how these are being dealt with. I've spoken to you on one or two occasions in the past, Ian, and I've expressed my concern over the fact that when I've logged a service request with, say, the contact centre, you said, look, Councillor, it's still a members' inquiry. Well, actually, if we're having a new system that's going to make a distinction between a request for information about something and something which is purely a service request, and I think that's a healthy thing, and I look forward to hearing more about that from you next week, this week when we speak offline. So I suppose that's an observation, but just a couple of questions. I'm sorry I've gone on, Chairman. Thank you.
I'm very happy to run through the members' inquiry system that's proposed. I think Councillor Mathers has had the opportunity to have a go at it as well. So very happy to do that. And it will make that distinction between a service request and a member's inquiry. In terms of your two other questions, policy and application, it is a tricky one, Councillor, because the reason why is when it tends to happen in the housing world, where there is the social housing allocation policy that's introduced, that we have in place. What tends to happen is that officers will often make a decision based on whatever that policy is, and the resident may not be happy with our application of that policy. And when you look at the housing complaints, there's a big chunk that will be all about that, where people are challenging decisions that we've made in terms of the way we've applied it. The majority of those inquiries tend to end up with the Ombudsman, because the Ombudsman then have to look at the policy, and then they have to decide whether we've actually applied it correctly or not. It's in that area that tends to be where there's dispute, because I think what people tend to want is they may have a particular accommodation they live in, but they believe, for rightly or wrongly, for whatever reason, that they're entitled to a larger property, and that our application of that is incorrect. So we may say 2-bedroom, but they think actually it should be a 3-bedroom. Or they may say, well, actually a room downstairs, which is maybe a dining room, but we say actually you can use that as a bedroom. So you end up with that sort of dispute where they're saying, well, actually you haven't actually applied the policy, because that's a dining room, it's not a bedroom. And it's that dispute that we have to sort of deal with. So it's a tricky area. But what I can do is assure you that officers will always try and make sure that if there is a policy, we apply that, and then we sort of try and deal with it. Where people are not happy, the Ombudsman ultimately will have to sit in judgment of that. In terms of discouraging complaints or the too ready to accept a complaint in the formal route, actually statistically what tends to happen is, and it's verified by, I guess, the figures that I've provided, what tends to happen is when people ring up the contact centre, or generally, they'll eventually end up with a complaints team somehow, and they'll speak, and we will always say to them, look, let's try and go down the informal route. And what we tend to do is there's a huge number of complaints that we'll actually send directly to officers and say, well, actually, can you try and sort it? And that there is that dialogue that takes place, and the majority of that 4,473 will actually be resolved through dialogue, because that's us trying to deal with it informally. But there will be some. There's 800 odd complaints where people say, actually, we're not happy. You can't. We want to go down the formal route, and so we then take that. We then take that approach. But the other thing I would finally, I suppose, say is that if you think about the number of residents that are in this borough, the number of properties that we look after, the number of children that we care for, that we have some involvement with, adults, the number of formal complaints, 802, with a borough of our size, actually is really quite small, and it's that sheer number of informal approaches that takes place.
Thank you. It is smaller, but it is slightly larger than previous. But I know your team continues to work on that. I think we have a remit around resident experience, and I'm increasingly noticing examples where I'm wishing the best for a good resident experience with officers under pressure, services under pressure, because of other reasons, and just willing it to go well for someone in crisis. And occasionally there are moments when an officer, for whatever reason, does something wrong, and that's raised through kind of the ME process, or someone has been through all the complaint process, the Ombudsman has agreed with them, and then there's sometimes an inaction or a delayed action from the council, and then it comes as a member's inquiry almost, and we have to prompt, and there will be some things that are never resolved. But I guess there's two things that come to mind. One, in terms of the ME approach and the new ME approach, how are bits of bad practice being extracted from members' inquiries in order to improve customer service or resident experience? And is there going to be a way of resolving cases? So, for example, in the new system that's all automated, there's a caseload management system almost for councillors and for yourselves, which is going to hopefully take some getting used to, but we'll be there. And I guess sometimes the interactions in the past, because it's email-based, have meant that, recently I had an ME answered well within the time frame. A response to my query back, which was the key bit that needed action, took months to resolve a critical housing situation. And that was not about resourcing in the council, that was about performance of that team or that individual. And I worry, the two things I worry about, one is that I had to really escalate that, and that if that led to any improvement for the individuals involved. I'm not looking for, sanction, but improvement there. And also, because it wasn't a formal complaint but came through the ME system, I'm not sure the resident got the same apologetic tone that comes across when there's been fault or blame on the council. That's a terrible way of wording it, but we go, we're sorry, and you can get a formal letter after the formal process, or there's a quick, we're sorry, look, we sorted it. When it comes to MEs, that doesn't always happen, and we as councillors don't want to bad-mouth anyone in these processes, but sometimes the resident hearing from the officers, we're sorry, formally, from MEs, I think makes a significant difference to repairing, a mistake. And so it's around what are the potential possibilities and how could those things be captured, both how something is completed and resolved, how a complaint is drawn out of an ME, and equally how an apology is provided when there's clear blame from the ME system in its new guise.
I think also, just on the back of that, because as we've been talking, I've been jotting down a few things for a sort of summary of all this, but I've written down use of the report and learning points. And I don't necessarily want you to go into any great detail, but just to think about. I think this is we all do think this is a very good report, and we can see trends and we can see highlights. But another thing we can see is where there are things that jump out that we would hope that officers and others would say, oh right, well that's telling us something that your report is saying, and of course it's across a range of different services. And I suppose my follow-on observational question is, to what extent, given that this is all coming to us, does this overall report get used, maybe in summary, maybe, as I say, in learning points, to be taken back to officers to say, well, look, having got all this data, because the criticism is always, we got lots of data, but what do we do with it? How do we turn this into a practical tool that even in good departments that are fantastic, they could still look at it and go, okay, well, that's something we can, it may not, the other side of the coin is, of course, they may not agree, no matter what the outcome is, but because there's always a sort of slightly defensive attitude, whichever organisation you're in. But I just think it's a useful highlight to ask the question, how is this used as a learning tool for those who are the subject of it?
There's quite a lot of different points to okay. So what happens is, in terms of the actual report, before it even comes to the committee, it goes to all the senior managers, so they will make sure they see that. I've attended before the corporate management team, which is the senior management team, to present that, to explain some of the things that are going on, and in addition to that, I attend various sort of meetings of the different service areas to explain to them the things that's sort of going on. So that's sort of how it sort of works sort of downwards in terms of what we do within the system. When a complaint, which is easier for me to sort of deal with, when it's completed, there is a form that we complete which records what's actually been learnt from that, and that's then shared with the service areas so that they make sure they make sure they get it right. What should have happened, Councillor Mathers, with that members' inquiry is that there should have been a follow-up, and that whoever was following up should have made sure that whatever that key point is was actually progressed, and that you shouldn't have to chase, someone else shouldn't have to chase. We should be making sure that's happening. That's what should happen. The new system will enable us, you, me, everyone else, to provide data. So at a touch of a button, you'll get lots of data, which will then start to highlight some of the issues. The current members' inquiries process, which I think you've kind of like identified, is that I provide you with all this data there, but it's not easy to get hold of. So therefore, it's more difficult for you to identify what the trends are. Whereas the system that's going to be introduced is more automated, so we will be able to identify various sort of customer service issues because it's there, and then that can then be shared. The other thing that it will do, though, is it'll start to provide it by the service areas, so you can then start to see, well, planning is this, so there's this issue. It's a bit like I provided you with the top 3 members' inquiries by ward. It's similar to that, so you'll end up with what's your top 3. So that's the things that we need to start working on. But I think the point that you made earlier about saying sorry is important, because actually a contrition, and we don't always get it right. You know, we do get things wrong, and it's about putting that person back to where they would have been had they, had we not made that mistake. I think that the process with members' inquiries works slightly differently, in a sense that when a member's inquiry is responded to, so it'll be directly from Neil to Councillor Cawthorne. So I won't actually see that response, whatever that response is. But Neil's style will be different to mine, and different styles comes up with different sort of responses that you get. Whereas with the complaint side of things, I actually see every single complaint response that goes. So it's at that point that you can add a level of quality or a contrition or an apology. So maybe that's something that we need to work on in terms of when it comes to the members' inquiries process. It needs to be sort of have that same feel as a complaint. So that's something I'll certainly take away from that. I think that was all the questions.
It was an awful lot all at once. Thank you. Councillor Carr.
Oh, hi, sorry. I think probably following along the learning, and it's probably been already mentioned. I was just looking at the members' inquiries, and a lot of them, like the top 3 things, were fly tipping, etc. I could see learnings from complaints, but I wondered if there was anything that we were doing in terms of learnings of ME inquiries.
The answer to that, Councillor, is I guess no. But I mean, I do collate the information and share that. But I think the old system, it's quite tricky to collate that information. And by the time you collate the information and share it, it's almost too late because so much time has passed. So I think you're absolutely right in that the new system will enable us to have the data at hand much quicker. We do have people within the council who can obtain that information currently. So that's something maybe I need to go back to them and sort of say, well, actually, we need to be sharing this information. It could be done monthly, because it's the complaint system is used on the same system as the members' inquiry system. So if we can get data on one, we should be able to get data on the other. So yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Mann.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to refocus what Narendra just mentioned, and just focus specifically on the fly tipping, because it's been mentioned several times in the table on page 10. And the ward I represent has got it as their most raised complaint, and we get that from our residents all the time. The council, obviously, we're all here to provide a service for the residents, and if this fly tipping is continuing in lots of wards, what deterrent measures are we using to stop this escalating further? And there are some wards where clearly it's not as big as an issue as some wards. Is there more effective deterrence there? I mean, sometimes we can be a victim of our own success. Sometimes we have a fly tipping issue, we clear that fly tipping, the residents are semi-satisfied, but it helps the fly tippers as well in terms of it's been cleared. So somebody is disposing of waste in an unreasonable way, in a location that's they're not supposed to dispose that waste. If it's getting cleared regularly, that's sort of semi-encouragement, if you can see what I'm saying, to the fly tippers as well. What are we using as a deterrent to stop this from happening? Because like everybody in this room, I'm hoping that we're using these figures to plan ahead and reduce some of our first volume and second volume complaints rather than just having them recorded.
Councillor Mann, just before Ian jumps in, I don't know whether Ian, you have an answer for that, but I'm not sure it is something that Ian can comment on in too detail, because it's actually under the remit of a different select committee. And prior to you being elected, Councillor, there was actually fairly recently the Residents' Education and Environmental Services select committee put together a review of fly tipping and littering across the borough. So if you'd like, I can forward you that a link to that report, which does answer some of the questions that you've raised there, and that these things are being looked at and thought of.
Thank you.
You see, this table, and it's very telling where the fly tipping comes as a major. Where are we? Page 10, as a major issue. But what I will say to you is this: Councillor Mann, that it's something that's being looked at LGA level in a very big way at the moment, because not just us, but lots of authorities are having this as a big trouble. It drives me mad because we kind of we've made a rod for our own backs in some ways, because generally across the board, because we have an obligation to clear up and look after, but in so doing, fly tippers know that we'll do it, and in that sense, although I'm going off subject here, or at least what we're supposed to do, the real answer is enforcement, and the effective enforcement. And what we're looking at on the LGA is talking to the government about absolutely ramping up the sentences. But I've been suggesting far more than that, because it's usually just fines, and they're not paid, or they're paid over a long period of time at a very small amount of money. I'm looking at what we've been suggesting, looking at other countries, is confiscation of vehicles, which is a much bigger deterrent that you were talking about than issuing any number of fines. So we'll stop it there. But it's a big issue, and we're trying to turn it on its head in a sense, because we do have this dynamic that fly tip will come along, it gets reported, we come along, sort it out, off we go. There's no disincentive, and it's going to get worse because people are going to be under a lot more pressure as time goes on, businesses and so forth, not getting licenses, just dumping stuff. So we're working on it. Can I leave it at that? Is that all right? Okay, great. Any other questions? Councillor Mathers.
Can I just ask, for my own information, how do we measure the overall kind of customer service experience and improvements? So complaints is about, I suppose, the way our process works is about individual issues with services. But what's the appraisal system for when someone gets through online or in person or on the phone? And how the consistency of that experience of contacting either to complain or to ask for a service, because I think there isn't a report necessarily on that bit, on how people found the complaints process or how they found their ability to report, and there isn't as much on our website, to my knowledge. I haven't really seen it when I've used it, a kind of, those little annoying surveys that pop up and say, how did you find this online reporting process, so that we can get a sense of, as people increasingly use online to contact with compliments, complaints or service requests, there isn't that feedback about every other site tends to say, how did you find this? Was it easy to use? Was it easy to click? What did it like? And you just rate it very quickly with a couple of clicks. We don't seem to have that. So I just wondered what the general process was.
In terms of, we tend not to use the word resolution, but we tend to use the word respond, because that's the only way really we can say whether, because it's hard for me to know whether someone's actually satisfied with the decision and the response that we've had. What we did do a few years ago is that we actually selected, I think it was around 50 to 100 complaints, and actually an external body of people actually called the complainants and actually said, what did you think about the survey, the actual complaint process, not about the actual complaint, but the process that you went through. We haven't done it for many years, but that's what we did do to try and find. The only thing that I would say in terms of the feedback that we had from that survey was that people tended to get mixed up between the outcome. If the outcome was a positive one, it tended to be a positive response. But if it was a negative response, then it tended to result in someone saying, well, actually, this and this is not right, I'm not happy about this. And we didn't find out as much about the process as we would like to have done. But that's what we did years ago, just to try and identify. But that was only a very small selection of people. But I will take on board what you've said about a click, which a lot of larger organisations actually do that. When you finish speaking to someone, they'll say, well, actually, would you like to rate us after that? And it didn't seem too much time to take up. So I will go back and bear that in mind.
Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the data, thanks. We talk about the 10 days SLAs. Is it possible to almost get the other side of the coin in the sense when it didn't meet the SLA, how many days it took these complaints and ME to actually be resolved? So when I'm not saying we missed an SLA, but when it is it breached massively? So we're talking on average 15, 20 days. I'd be quite interested to see that data, maybe broken down by category if possible, just to see where maybe the problem areas are, any bottlenecks, just,
That's very easy to do, actually, Councillor. What I can say to you is that the SLAs that are breached tend to be within 1 or 2 days, so it tends to be day 12, day 13. Statistically, although I don't have it in front of me, from memory, I believe that something like 99% are responded to within 20 working days. But the majority tend to be around about 11 or 12 working days. That's where they miss it. And I think that's more planning. If you planned it, quit earlier, then you're more likely to meet that deadline. The areas where the SLAs are most breached will be in the planning world. And I think that tends to be because that there's a bit more work that needs to be done to actually find out, to provide a response. So there's lots of other people that needs to be involved, maybe even a site visit that needs to take place. So that's one area. Children's and adult services as well, they tend to take more time because they're more complex and more tricky to deal with. The ones that are sort of kind of like dead easy to deal with are in the waste world. You knock those complaints out really quickly because some of the times I'm not quite sure they're actually complaints. We've just treated it as a complaint, as I think you said earlier on, Councillor. But I'm very happy to provide you with that data. No problems.
All right. Last two very quick matters from me. You mentioned earlier about our timings being pretty robust, set against other authorities. I think it might be interesting for us to see those benchmarks and against whom we are benchmarking. I mean, from what you've said all the way through now, we have a set of timings, response timings, which are pretty sharp, and therefore, if even though we sometimes may overrun our own, they're still less than others. So that might be a piece of information which would be quite useful. The other thing is, and I've noticed this ever more increasingly, that what concerns residents when they have made either a complaint or what isn't really a complaint but nevertheless an observation is being kept informed about what's happening. As a councillor, in this day and age, I mean, I go back to the days when we used to have dictaphones and people who would write things for us, and it would take 6 weeks to write a letter because stuff, the tape would come back and the letter would come back and you'd correct it and it would go back again. Well, of course, nowadays everybody wants an immediate response, but it's not just the response; it's where are we now? Where are you with my complaint? What's happening? And you look at the list of correspondence, and you only replied on Friday, and today's Tuesday. But I think there is an element about just responding and just saying, look, this is where we are today. I don't know if it may be too much of an expectation for hard-pressed officers, but maybe action dates that just say an update or something along those lines, because that does seem to be a considerable cause of frustration. And I'm not saying you should do it, but just have a look at it, see what you think about the idea of getting back to people. All right, look, that was really fascinating. I'm very grateful, and I'm glad it's all coming to us because it makes sense for one committee to review. But thank you so much for all your help, and certainly there's a lot in there that I can take away as a councillor and sort of shape what I do by virtue of this. Thank you. Last two on the agenda: Cabinet Forward Plan and Work Programme. Neil.
Yeah, not a lot to say on these. Obviously, the Cabinet Forward Plan is there for any comment or questions, as is the Work Programme.
Just in June, I mentioned a review of kind of reacting to changes with democratic services running elections or election services running elections, learnings and things that would be useful when having to deal with, election legislation changes or polling station changes, etc. It's not on the multi-year work plan. Just wondered if there'd been any progress.
I'm surprised. I did send an email to you, Councillor, at the time, very, very closely after the meeting. Just to summarise, it was the I can't recall the exact wording, but in summation, it was it's not within the remit of the committee, and the electoral services is a matter for full council, so it's not something we can discuss here. However, the head of service and monitoring officer, not the monitoring officer, the returning officer did say he's very happy to discuss anything with you informally on that matter. But I will forward you the email again. I'll forward you the email again, no problems. Just to say, obviously, the item on procurement that was scheduled for November will now obviously be taken off and superseded by the ongoing review process. So that's the only slight change to it. But beyond that, I've tried to put the things that are suitable on there, following the request from the previous meeting.
We really must get a system where when you start speaking, the machine comes on. We can, like we've got nothing else to spend our money on. We can, Councillor Mathan and I can talk about any further matters that need to come along. And also, he did say that he was very happy to do this, but I need to go and talk to the Chief Exec just to get a feel for any issues that he's keen on for us to have a look at, which would be useful. And we did say, didn't we, at the time, that we'd be very happy to help out and look into issues that perhaps he doesn't have time. And I think that'll be a useful exercise because he'll see things from a slightly different perspective to make that comment. All right, good. Well, unless there's any other issues or anything else anybody wants to raise, I will close the meeting at nearly 8:30. Okay, thank you.